I'm going to steal one bit from that, so you're the only ones who realize that. I'll make you participate. Did anybody go to my class this morning? Raise your hand if you did. Oh, okay. I'm plagiarizing nothing from that. I do need, as always, what do I need? What do I always need? Readers. I always need readers. I need 5 readers. The first one has to be a good reader. You did a really good job this morning. So you get rewarded for another one. No, it's on page 2. I've got it marked, which you'll have to read. Short. Anybody want this? A little bit longer. And even longer. Anybody? Come on back to the class. Okay.
I'm way in the back, but
I know. I bet your voice. You're hot. So I'm going to take you way back, like Matt did, to when I was 23 years old. A long time ago. And I'd just gotten out of college, and I had my first real job, and I had to figure out where to go to church. I'd grown up in a fundamentalist church, and I didn't want to remain a fundamentalist. And when my parents split up, I ended up going to a Presbyterian church for 6 months. Hated that. Went to a Methodist church, was a member there for about 4 months, didn't like that. And then I went to a charismatic church for 2 years, never learned to speak in tongues. I left, went to college, came back, and I was trying to figure out what I should be. And I had a friend who was going to a Lutheran church, and he invited me to come along. And I'll keep on talking. And so I started going to this Lutheran church. It was, what were the denominations back then? ALC? ALC. It was an ALC church. And there were certain reasons I liked going to the church. One, I liked the liturgy. I'd never gone to a church with very much of a liturgy. 2, I liked the sense of history, that we're Lutherans and it goes back in time. 3, I also liked the diversity of opinion. I did. Sorry, that's what they make me do on TV.
Somebody switch the channel. We're not that formal now. Sorry.
I'm gonna get a dress here.
At least you have a t-shirt on you.
Yeah. I like the fact that I didn't know if the person on my right or left was pro-choice or pro-life, and I was thinking I'm going to spend some time figuring out where I'm going with a lot of political stuff, religious stuff, and as you all know, I'm still doing that. That's what the class I did this morning was just something I wanted to do so I could think about it, not because I really wanted to talk to you guys. But I also like Luther. I like Luther. I was a history major, so I knew Luther, and I liked him, and we had things in common. One, we're both intense and obsessive, and he was frequently very right on issues and frequently very wrong on issues, okay? And it was funny because my best friend, when I had moved to this place, was Jewish. He was the first Jewish friend I'd had, and we became close friends. And I'd gone to his synagogue, and I invited him to come to my church. And we were talking, and his question to me was, "You're a Lutheran? You chose to be Lutheran?" And I was like, "Yeah, I chose to be Lutheran." He goes, "Why would anyone choose to be a Lutheran?" And it was a weird question, because I had no idea what the issue was. And it's funny because just about 6 months ago, well, actually I had a good Jewish friend come here last week to go to the last Sincerely and Utterly Wrong class, and he brought up the same issue again. He said, "I don't understand it. Why would someone like you decide to become Lutheran?" And I didn't have a really good answer, but I thought I would engage and deal with the issue that they were all thinking about, that I didn't think about, that wasn't an issue at that time. And that is, we had a brief discussion about this earlier.
You brought the upper room down. We're not in the upper room. Why is this not working? How to use the right one? Change the channel, I messed that one up. There you go.
Just don't tell the I have to tell the story all over again, right?
It's on video, go ahead.
People in the upper room have heard
They're having a great time. So the issue that I didn't understand at the time, but I've come to fully appreciate, is 4 things we're going to learn about Luther today. 1, and this is the first one, And we alluded to this last week. The speaker last week talked about Luther's anti-Jewish writings, and what was his explanation? Do you remember? That he was getting old, that he was getting constipated, and he was having lots of issues. All of that is true. He was getting old, he was getting constipated, but the fact is he had anti-Jewish writings from when he was very, very young. This is the work that everybody focuses on. It's called On the Jews and Their Lives, 3 years before he dies, in 1543. He decides to write this 65,000 word book on this. I've read it before, and I read 20,000 pages of it this past week, and it doesn't do any better in time. Here's one of his main points about Jews at the end of the book, at the beginning of the book. They must assuredly be the base, whoring people, that is, no people of God, and their boast of lineage, that they're Jews. Circumcision and the law, being the Old Testament, must be accounted as filth. They are full of the devil's feces, which they wallow in like swine. And that's pretty brutal, but that's not the only thing he writes. He had a 7-point plan for the princes and so forth in the area of Germany. He said, we've got to fix things here. And the problem were Jews. And he had already, in 1536, been instrumental in forcing all Jews out of the area of Saxony in Germany. Here's his 7-point plan. This is what he wants everybody in Germany and the Holy Roman Emperor to be doing. 1, burn all synagogues and schools. 2, raise all private property and homes of Jews. They should not own anything. Confiscate all religious writings. The funny thing is, the amazing thing about this is, we don't usually hear the Old Testament preached on much at Lutheran churches, but he loved the Old Testament. For every sermon he gave on the New Testament, he gave 4 or 5 on the Old Testament. If you look through the books that he wrote, and he wrote a massive amount of books. Just imagine writing 12 hours a day for an entire life, and that's what his writing was like. He loved the Old Testament, he just hated the Jews. Bar rabbis from preaching, or they would be executed. Provide no protection for Jews on highways, and this is very important at this time. You travel on highways, there are a lot of bandits, people who hang out, and they steal from you and so forth. And then finally, prevent lending and take away all their gold and silver and give that to the Christians. So this is his plan. And some people pick up on this and think this is great. And he ends up concluding the book with this, there's also, put the young Jews in labor camps so that they would be doing work for the Christians. It's when I started reading through the book again, I was realizing our first stop's at Auschwitz, and it's not like completely unrelated to what we're doing. Luther was a great guy, and his notion about grace and faith and all of those things are terrific, but he also was incredibly, incredibly wrong on this issue. And this is something, when I did the Utterly and Sincerely Wrong class, I was trying to show you that there are ways of reading the Bible that have proved to be wrong. And Luther reads the Bible in a particular way that ends up causing a lot of damage. This is how he ends up his book. We are at fault in not slaying them. He's referring to the Jews. You have the passage. And so you can see, I'm not taking out of context. What he's saying is, why is it that Jews hate us so much? I can't understand it. It makes no sense to me. We're great and they're not. Why aren't they our buddies? And so this is what he has to say. Most of the paragraph, I think it ends a line short.
Okay. There is no other explanation for this than the one cited earlier from Moses, namely that God has struck them with, quote, madness and blindness and confusion of mind, end quote. So we are even at fault in not avenging all this innocent blood of our Lord and of the Christians, which they shed for 300 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the blood of the children they have shed since then, which still shines forth from their eyes and their skin.
Stop right there. In the Middle Ages, there's this widespread belief that Jews did certain things. One was that they would have someone sneak into church, get Holy Communion, and run away with it because they believed in transubstantiation. So that's actually Jesus. And then they'd go have a meeting and everybody would stab it and try to kill Jesus. The other thing that was a widespread belief was that they would go and grab children and try to force them to become Jews, Christian children, and if they didn't convert, then they would slaughter them. And Luther bought in big time on both things. He believes they're doing it, and that's what he's saying. They won't convert, and not only that, they're killing our kids. What should we do about it?
We are at fault in not slaying them. Rather, we allow them to live freely in our midst, despite all their murdering, cursing, blaspheming, lying, and defaming. We protect and shield their synagogues, houses, life, and property in this property. In this way, we make them lazy and secure, and encourage them to fleece us boldly of our money and goods, as well as to mock and deride us, with a view to finally overcoming us, killing us all for such a great sin, and robbing us of all our property, as they daily pray and hope.
And that had to do with the process of loaning money. Only Jews could loan money because it was against, Jesus said you shouldn't be loaning money, and so they allowed Jews to do stuff like that. And they were saying they're charging high interest rates and then taking our property away, so we need to stop this. So pretty harsh stuff. And it's not just there. There's a book called Table Talks that we talked about last time we were together, where he would just sit around, people would ask him questions, he'd answer. Sometimes they're incredibly funny. Like one time a student says, so what did God do before he made the earth? And what was he doing all that time? And Luther says to him, he was making hell for people who ask questions like that. But he has a student ask this question, which is, why do Jews refuse to convert to Christianity? And his response, because God hardened their hearts and deserted them because of their stubbornness. So again, this is a theme that you see late in his life. And we were told last time that it's largely because he was getting old and cranky and those sorts of things. Well, we're going to walk through some of the things he wrote during his life. And you guys are going to read to me and to each other what he was saying about the Jews throughout his life. And there is a major dramatic change that occurs in his writing and in his life, and we'll see it, and we'll talk about why that change occurred. So who has the 1514 sheet?
I do.
Okay, and we'll start with, this is 1514. So this is 30 years before the writings we just saw, okay? You're going to read both of these. The first one's his very first writing on Jews, the very first thing he ever says.
Conversion of the Jews will be the work of God alone, operating from within, and not of man working, or rather playing from without. If these offenses be taken away, worse will follow, for they are thus given over by the wrath of God to reprobation, that they may become incorrigible, as Ecclesiastes says, for everyone who is incorrigible is rendered worse rather than better by correction.
So what is he saying there? He's saying they're difficult, we're not going to be able to convert them on our own, they're so stubborn that the only one who's going to be able to convert them to Christianity, and that's his goal, is a conversion to Christianity. I want them to convert. And he says, we can't do it. And then 7 years later, he picks up the theme again.
It is known well enough that the Jews have at all times been Christ's greatest enemies, their claim to be God's most loyal friends notwithstanding. It's undeniable that this verse chronicles their fate.
He's talking about Psalm 68:21. I'm sure you all have it memorized.
Their head is shattered. They no longer have a kingdom, a government, a priesthood. Soon after Christ's ascent, they lost that head and never regained it, which is the result of but one crime, namely their hostility to Christ and their refusal to let him be God.
So we were told that this was something that developed late in his life. We're actually seeing this was an issue that he became pretty obsessive about at an early point. The question is, he wants to convert them, and what do you do about it? So in 1523, he decides to write a work in which he says the way to convert them is to be nice to the Jews, okay? And so we have Martin Luther, who has 1523. You do? And this is his book. It's a lengthy book, and it's an interesting book, and I think people misinterpret it, but the name of the book is that Jesus Christ was born a Jew.
If we really want to help Jews, we must be guided in our dealings with them, not by papal law, but by the law of Christian love. We must receive them cordially and permit them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. If some of them should prove stiff-necked, what of it? After all, we ourselves are not all good Christians either.
So he's realizing, you know, they're not great people, but we're not either. What we should do is try to be nicer to them, to be more open to them, and maybe they'll convert at that point. But about 10 or 12 years later, we can see a pretty strong change in his attitude. There's, I told you that there were, Germans were pushing Jews out of a number of territories, and the leading rabbi in one of these territories comes to Martin Luther, who is very prominent and powerful, and says, can you help us? Please don't make them burn our synagogues. Please make sure that they don't take away our property. Please don't force us out of our homes. And he writes back to Rabbi Josel in 1536. This is 13 years later.
He said, I would willingly do my best for your people, but I will not contribute your Jewish obstinacy by my own kind actions. You must find another intermediary with my good Lord.
And in that particular area, they are actually moved out and cleared out in this time. And Josel writes in response to the leader saying, I couldn't get any help from this guy. And what does he say?
Due to that priest, whose name was Martin Luther, may his body and soul be bound up in hell, who wrote and issued many heretical books in which he said that whoever would help the Jews was doomed to perdition. So
in the 1520s, he's starting to think, well, maybe we convert them. And what happens during 1520s, 1530s? That's a rhetorical question. What happens is he ends up doing translations of the liturgy for Jews and into German, and he starts translating the Bible. And his interest is not so much in translating the New Testament. He wants to translate the Old Testament because he thinks if Jews read the Old Testament the same way that I read it, it'll become obvious to them that Jesus is the Christ and that they should convert. What happens when he does that? Many Jews read the text and they don't reach the conclusions that he reached. And so what explanation is there for what was going on? What was wrong? Why didn't they convert? Well, he then looks at him and says, for the last 1,500 years, they've had a pretty rough life. It's been terrible. Their lives have been terrible. And the only thing is, that must be God who's allowing them to do it. And it's proof that these people are, that they've been abandoned by God. They originally had the covenant, but they've been abandoned by God. And I've given them the opportunity to read this stuff and to convert, and it just didn't happen. So in the 1540s, things turn. We saw 1543 how it was. It gets even worse in 1544 and 1546. Who has 1544? Don. This is the sermon he gives, Isaiah 53.
The Jews still kill Christ daily, not in the sense that they merely desire to do so, but rather in fact, for they slaughter many Christian infants and children. In short, they are killers forever.
And then in one of his final sermons in 1546, he again, this is a topic, and I'm just picking, I picked like 5 of these. I could have picked 100 of them. There are many, many things like this. And this is one of his final sermons before he dies.
They are our public enemies. They do not stop blaspheming our Lord Christ, calling the Virgin Mary a whore, Christ a bastard, and us challenging or abortions. And us changeling or abortions. If they kill us all, then
essentially we're the result of a bad abortion. Someone tried to abort us, and we still were born, and that's what they're saying about us. And to tell you the truth, there's a lot of nasty stuff that Jews are writing about Christians at this time. And if you read the Talmud, Jesus does appear in the Talmud as the son of a bastard son of Mary, because the Talmud suggests that the Roman soldiers come through and a particular guy raped Mary and she had the kid named Jesus. The Talmud doesn't say it's Jesus, but anybody who understands the language at that time. So it's not like he's just making all this stuff up. There is a lot of back and forth, a lot of polemic, like he said, and it gets more and more intense. So finish that one, and then he has one final passage.
They do it often, especially those who pose as physicians, though sometimes they help. For the devil helps to finish it in the end.
It's a funny thing that one of the major meetings of the church, which one was it? It starts with a C. In the 1100s, it goes through and outlines all the things that you're supposed to do and not do, and the council. One of the things in there is that Christians are not allowed to go see the doctor. You should only go to the church to be healed. You should do healing through the church. And this was actually an attack on Jews because almost all the doctors at that time were Jewish and they didn't trust the Jews. So it was basically saying, avoid them, don't go near them. Lateran Council, the Lateran Council, thanks for not talking, help me think it through. The Lateran Council of the 1100s eventually comes up with this thing. It's weird because you're reading it, it's like, don't go to the doctor. And you're like, why can't they go to the doctor? But there you find out it's all about the Jews. And in this case, you get to see the attitude toward the Jews. You go in and they help, some of you they're helping, but the others they're secretly killing. And that's, that's their explanation for people who go to the doctor and they don't get better. So if there are any doctors here who want to offer a counter opinion, and I know there are, and this is the last thing we'll have from Luther on this issue.
Yet we will show them Christian love and pray for them, that they may be converted to receive the Lord.
So he's reached back to 1920s where he says, let's be nice to them, try to convert them. This is the last thing he writes about the Jews.
Whom they should honor properly before us. Whoever will not do this is no doubt a malicious Jew, who will not stop blaspheming Christ, draining you dry, and, if he can, killing you.
So there was a recent conference in Indiana where all the Luther scholars got together, and this is their conclusion about Luther. They say, at no point in his career does Luther ever express hope for the Jew as a Jew. Judaism is a dead religion, and Luther makes no distinction between Judaism and those who practice it, the Jews. What he says about one applies to the other. What he does express in varying degrees is a hope for the Jew to become a Christian. And that's what changes. His attitude toward the Jews, he never believes that they will go to heaven on their own. They all have to convert to Christianity. But what changes is his sense, his optimism. In the 1920s, early 30s, he's very optimistic that the Jews are going to convert because he's sure that he's going to be able to convince them with his Bible and with his liturgy. And when that doesn't happen, then he turns on them in a very brutal way. He had no Jewish friends, and that's something to think about. He didn't have someone he could turn to and say, is this what it's like really, and are you guys all like this? And it's easier to write this sort of stuff when you don't have friends or people that you're acquaintances with. But he ended up borrowing all of these themes that are running around at that time. So it's brutal, it's unpleasant, and it's something we don't talk about. But I grew up and I was taught, and I read Kittleson's biography several years ago, and he loves Luther and he's great, but this is not much different than dealing with other historical figures like Thomas Jefferson, who did a number of wonderful and great things, but also did some not so great things. Or even Martin Luther King Jr., who did a number of wonderful and great things, but also, the FBI took advantage of the fact that, he did some not so great things. And this is just sort of like, we've all learned about Luther, but we haven't spent much time on this stuff. And it is pretty shocking when you hear some of these things. But an important thing to remember, and this is our second point, Luther didn't invent this stuff. He actually borrows this stuff. This is all running around, and in the Middle Ages, there are a lot of these ideas, particularly starting around the year 1100. This stuff picks up. And the question is, how did we get from a religion that started by a Jew to a point where Jews are seen as the enemy of Christians? This is stuff that you guys probably all know about Jesus, but just emphasizes how Jewish Jesus was. And you get that in Matthew in particular. If you want to read some sort of, in addition to everything else we're reading, I would read the Gospel of Matthew before we go to Germany, just to see how Jewish he is when we go there. He says at one point, I've come to save the lost sheep of Israel. That's it, that's his ministry. And in Matthew, only one Gentile comes to him and asks for help, and he provides help to her only because he thinks she gives a clever answer to him on a riddle that he has. And then followers comprise almost exclusively of Jews. And in certain Gospels, it is all Jews. We read the Message, borrowed and interpreted from the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the Old Testament, 3 different terms. And I've told you I'm not a fan of the term Old Testament, but Tanakh is just a reference to the 3 sections they take. It's an acronym, actually. And remember, Jesus says, I came not to change a jot or tittle. I didn't change anything. And in fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, he decides that the law is not tough enough. He makes the law tougher. For instance, he says, you've been told not to kill anybody, but then he takes the next step and says what? You're supposed to love your enemies. He's saying that the law is okay, but I'm going to make it even stronger on a number of points. And the fights with the Pharisees, and Pharisees come out badly in a lot of our church sermons and so forth, but the reason he's fighting with the Pharisees is that they agree so much on stuff. Both of them are fighting to convince people to bring Jewish law into their personal lives. And the question is, how do you do that? And they have different ideas on this. And then Judea was filled with would-be Messiah figures and miracle workers. He's not the only guy who's running around saying, I'm the Son of God. A number of others. We have ones mentioned in Acts. We have ones mentioned in a couple of the Gospels as well. And then finally, crucifixion was a Roman form of execution. It's not something that Jews did. Jews didn't put other people on the cross. It's a violation of a particular verse in Deuteronomy. And it's interesting because there was a poll that was released just last week in which Americans were asked, do you believe the Jews killed Jesus? And 30% of the people responding said yes. So there's still massive confusion about what went on there. Maybe Jews were up against him and he was a Jew fighting with other Jews who had disagreements, but he wouldn't have died unless the Romans got involved and decided to execute him. So to help you understand this whole thing about that he didn't invent anti-Semitism, I'm going to do this thing. It involves 5 volunteers, and it'll be you guys over here, you 3, you 2, and Rainey can be Jesus. Just hop up here if you don't mind. You'll be here. You look forward. And then each of you line up and look at Rainey. What a wonderful person she is. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can go back. You're sort of sound anyway. So I'm going to be Martin Luther. And you know, when I see Jesus, I'm all the way back here. This is 1500s. All these other people have had an impact on Jesus and what the way we perceive. This is true for anything. I mean, today, when we see Jesus, we think, oh, I'm just picking up the Bible and reading it myself. But as I mentioned last week, the question of how long was Jesus' ministry? And everybody says, how long? 3 years, but there's nothing in the Bible that says 3 years. That's just something that we picked up over time, and it's based on a misreading of John, because you have 3 Passovers, but if you figure that out, 1 Passover to a second Passover is how many years? 1. And a second Passover to a third Passover is 2, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that Jesus' ministry was probably 1 year long. So, but you start here, and this is Jesus, and then we have Paul. And Paul changes the message. He's interested in the kingdom of God, and that's what he's interested in, trying to convince people, telling people the kingdom of God's at hand. Paul changes the message. It's not a bad thing, but Paul changes the message from a religion of Jesus to a religion about Jesus, okay? It's a dramatic turn there. We're no longer talking about the kingdom of God. We're now talking about Jesus' resurrection. Primarily, that's what Paul is very much interested in. This is Emperor Constantine. Constantine, do you remember the story with Constantine? He's getting ready to fight, and he's at the Milvian Bridge, and then he sees a sign. And what's the sign say, Don? Do you remember?
In the clouds he sees a cross, and it says, by this symbol you shall be victorious. And
so he changes the important thing about Christianity from the resurrection to the cross, which was a symbol not used in the first 300 years of the church. Jesus' death and the cross become the most important things going. And when the cross becomes the crucial point, and you can see the difference. Orthodox Christians, the main thing in their faith is the Trinity, not Jesus. Jesus is important to us as Protestants. That's the heritage we picked up from Constantine. And then a few years later, we have John Chrysostom, and he is very interested in answering the question that Constantine's raised, which is who killed Jesus? And John Chrysostom had 2 problems in his church. His main problem was a lot of the members of his congregation, he's around 380 or so, would go on Saturday to the synagogue and to church on Sunday. He didn't like that, but why would you do that? Most of them were farmers, and they were having bad crops, and they thought, well, if Yahweh can't do it, then we'll go see Jesus. So they were covering their bets. And John Chrysostom says, you can't do that anymore. You can't keep on going to the synagogue because the Jews killed God. He comes up with the term deicide. They are the killers of Christ, and Christ is God. And then we move back here to the 1100s, and we have Saint Anselm, A-N-S-E-L-M, And he comes up with this idea about what Jesus' death had to deal with. He comes up with this fancy term, substitutionary atonement, which basically means the law is burdensome and nasty and none of us can fulfill the law. So Jesus had to take all of our sins, put them on himself, and he would die. And die for our sins. This is an idea that didn't exist before this point. Jesus' understanding of his death was very different. So the law ends up becoming something horrible and burdensome. And the fact is, recent scholars have gone back and started reading Jews writing about the law about the time of Christ. And they thought it was a wonderful, great thing. Not only did it put them in the covenant, but if they screwed up, it would return them to the covenant. So the law was seen as a very positive thing, but Anselm said no, it wasn't. And then it brings me to Luther here back in. I now pick up each of these different things, and then I add an element to it. And I start picking up and teaching a thing called replacement theology. You guys can sit down. Thank you very much for applauding. And actually, this is something that people at our church would believe in and so forth, and that is that the covenant that was given in the Old Testament to the Jews is defunct and dead, no longer exists, and it's now moved to the church. And so these people here, Israel and the Jews after them, to make it to heaven, they can no longer rely on the covenant that God said, to Abraham, my covenant with you is eternal and will never end. Okay? They say that's no longer true and it's been transferred to the church. It's called supersessionism, and every time we've been to Israel, our guide always says, who in the group is a supersessionist? And I say they have no idea what you would be talking about, but I'm guessing maybe half. I don't know. Because they know what they're interested in is not supersessionism. He wants to know if we think he's going to hell or not as a Jew. That's the question basically when they say, are you guys a supersessionist or not? Or replacement theology, what a term. And Luther buys into this and he perpetuates this idea, and it means the only way to get to heaven is if you convert. That's why it was so important to him to try to convert the Jews. He really, really, really wanted to do that. And it just didn't work out, and he got angry and he took it very personally. So you guys following all that? So the second point is, he didn't invent it. This was an accumulation of things. The thing is, I think, we see this supersessionism. People still are perpetuating this idea, and it's led to a lot of horrible things. And the Catholic Church has rejected this. In the 1960s, at Second Vatican Council, they said Jews don't have to be converted to go to heaven. The ELCA, most people, professors in the ELCA, would say the same thing, but it's an idea that still kicks around. Conservative Christians, evangelicals, and fundamentalists would still buy into this completely. Okay, the third point, and that is that Luther's anti-Jewish writings had an influence on Protestants everywhere. And we'll try to pick up and go quickly for this last 10 minutes. It's not just in Germany where this is picked up. You can find it all over the place. You can find anywhere that you see anti-Semitic stuff going on. And I just picked, this is Bishop Alma White, who was the leader of the female KKK, which you might not have known was a vibrant, very big group. And she says in one of her major writings, through the efforts of the KKK, the people who have received greater enlightenment than any period since the Lutheran Reformation. Her hero is Luther, and she doesn't focus on grace, faith, all of those sorts of things, or Romans. She focuses on these writings, particularly late in his life, but throughout his life. So you can see it's being used in that context. It's also, beyond that, this is a famous historian writing about the influence of Luther. It says, whoever wrote against the Jews for whatever reason believed he had the right to justify himself by triumphantly referring to Luther. And the interesting thing about this is, do you see what year this is? This is before World War I, before the Holocaust or any of those things. And as Pastor Matt said, this is a time when there's a great deal of anger going on toward Jews within Germany and throughout Europe. It's not just there. And actually in America, we have a lot of anti-Semitism. So I'm going to jump ahead to Kristallnacht. Anyone want to explain to us what Kristallnacht is?
Yeah, that's the night that the Nazis went through most of Germany and smashed shops and destroyed property that belonged to Jewish people.
What does Kristallnacht mean?
Night of the glass.
Broken glass,
Broken
right.
glass.
And so this is a picture of a synagogue that happened, and this was what year, anybody know? 1938. And it happened, starts on the 9th of November and ends on the 10th. And the bishop in one of the major cities in Berlin this is like amazing to him, and he loves that this is great that this happened. So he decides to collect Luther's writings, put out a new edition, and in his foreword he says, on Luther's birthday, Luther's born November 10th, so it went into the day of his birthday. The synagogues are burning in Germany. Luther was the greatest anti-Semite of his time, the warner of his people against the Jews. So this is tremendous and amazing, and all sorts of things, and we should all be so thrilled to have him as part of our heritage. Not everybody agreed with this. Most of you know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is. Dietrich Bonhoeffer used Luther's writings to critique the Nazi Empire, to say that his message about faith and grace should convince us not to do all this stuff that's going on with the Jews. So there's a debate going on, but there's an institute created. If anyone went to my Sincerely and Utterly Wrong class, you would remember that in 1938, there's an institute created of all the major theologians who distributed sermons to every church, every Lutheran and Catholic church, to convince people that Jesus was not Jewish. They rewrote the liturgy, they translated the New Testament in a different way, they took out all references to compassion, all references to his Jewish faith, and turned the Pharisees into horrible people. For the next 7 years, they distribute sermons that are read everywhere throughout the country. And the interesting thing is, the arguments were different for Lutherans and Catholics. For Catholics, the argument was that Mary was conceived in an immaculate way, so she didn't have any Jewishness in her. And so when she then conceives through the virgin birth, Jesus, she was not Jewish. So he was not Jewish, he was Aryan. And to the Lutherans, they taught higher criticism, this stuff that you find in colleges and so forth, saying that the area where Jesus was, it's very complicated to talk about, that it was Gentile, which it was for a while, and then converted to Judaism, and both his parents were probably Aryan. And so it was this, it was using contemporary scholarship to convince intelligent people that this was the case. And again, this is 1960. This was a somewhat controversial statement, and people are responding and reacting to it still today. And that is, it is difficult to understand the behavior of most German Protestants in the first Nazi years unless one is aware of the influence of Martin Luther, the great founder of Protestantism, was both a passionate anti-Semite and a ferocious believer in absolute obedience to political authority. And that is true. We haven't talked about the Peasants' Rebellion, where he sided with the authorities instead of with the peasants, and later says that he regrets that. But the references to that we need to obey all authority is borrowed from Luther, from Romans, the book of Romans, and then applied by the Nazi authorities. This is Hitler's only reference to him in Mein Kampf. He's mentioning great Germans, and he says to them, great warriors. He's listing all the great warriors, and then he mentions a bunch of fighters and generals and stuff, belong not only the great statesmen, but other great reformers as well. Besides Frederick the Great stands Martin Luther, as well as Richard Wagner. He didn't emphasize it much. All the people around him were very much interested, and they're quoting him, quoting Luther on a number of things. And his education minister says at one point that the names of Hitler and Luther, he hopes, will eventually become synonymous one day. So a lot of horrible stuff going on at that time, taking advantage of this part of Luther's legacy. But you don't want to push this too far. And this is our fourth point. Luther did not cause the Holocaust. Luther's used and read all over the place. The Holocaust happened in a particular place. There's a number of things that were going on in Germany. And this is Mary Boyce. I like her writing a great deal. She says that the Christian teachings, Luther's teachings, were a sufficient cause, but that they were, Christian teaching was not the sufficient cause. It couldn't in and of itself have created the Shoah, which is the Holocaust. And we'll hear Shoah a lot. But it may be regarded as a necessary one. It created an atmosphere of anti-Judaism that existed there, but there were a number of other factors. Don mentioned the Treaty of Versailles, which created massive depression, economic problems. There were political problems that were going on at the same time. Eugenics comes into play. He does not ever talk about Jews in a way that equates them as a race. And the importance of eugenics is that, that if a Jew converted to Christianity, according to the Nazis, you're still a Jew because you're the part of the race. So it doesn't matter what you believe, you can't do anything about it. To Luther, if you convert, and now you're a Jew. So there's a substantial change in what's going on there.
Christian.
Christian, sorry. You then become a Christian. Here's Auschwitz, which we'll be going to. So you have a number, you have political things going on, you have biological things going on, you have economic things going on, you have any religious things going on. The Holocaust was an incredibly complicated thing. And it's not until the meetings in January, the major meeting in January of 1942, that the final solution is eventually adopted, and they decide to convert Auschwitz from a place where Russian and Polish enemies of the state were executed, but they decide to start putting Jews in there in mass quantities. And for the last 2 months, I've been going through watching all sorts of videos on Auschwitz, and when I'm working out the gym, listening to lectures in Germany. And the funny thing, just the whole process is crazy about how they eventually come to Auschwitz. And I'm sure we'll get to this when we're there. But first they start picking up kids that they considered not worthy of living. They end up killing 5,000 of them. Right? They test chambers on them, not at Auschwitz, but at other places in Germany, where they put them in, and they weren't sure how to do it. And in one case, they take a car, or take the tailpipe and run it into the room and make the kids sit there while they're doing this stuff. And then they test it on adults, about 100,000 adults end up doing it. And the whole idea of these torture, of the concentration camps, is that up until that time, they would take 500 Jews at a time, line them up in front of a trench. You've probably seen the stuff, and then shoot them all. But the Nazi leaders thought that this was harming the quality of the people doing the shooting. Do we really want these guys coming back after they've done these massive executions of thousands of individuals, particularly of women and children, coming back and running our country once the war is over, after we won? And they said, no, we need to do it in a way that we don't have much, that we're not touching it, we're not involved very much. We just bring them in, put 1,000 people in a room, tiny room, and then run the gas through it, and we'll do it that way. So Luther on his own didn't create this stuff, but he did help he did end up putting this, created an environment of anti-Judaism at that particular time. Well, Lutherans know about this, Lutheran leaders know about this. Most of us don't spend any time talking about this because it's sort of the underbelly of Luther's writings and thinkings. But in 1994, the ELCA put out a statement, and here, if you want to read the whole thing, it's here. If you don't mind passing those around. Do you mind passing these around? That's the full statement. There's actually a couple weasel sections in there that I'm not very fond of myself. But the ELCA decided in 1994 to apologize and to distance itself from Luther's writings on this subject. It says, Lutherans belonging to the ELCA feel a special burden in this regard because of certain elements in the legacy of the Reformer Martin Luther and the catastrophes, including the Holocaust of the 20th century, suffered by the Jews in places where Lutheran churches were strongly represented. You can see the rest. They go through and explain what they think he was responsible for, not responsible for. The amazing thing to me, I was going to a church in Evansville, Wisconsin this time, and this thing passed. We had no mention of it. Nobody had any idea what it was. And to tell you the truth, I don't think I've ever heard a sermon or a Sunday school class or anything touch on this topic, which is so incredibly important. I tried to bring a good friend of mine, Marty Katz, to come in and talk before we go to Israel on these things. But I did want to finish with one thing, and that is Germany and Israel. Who here has been to Israel? Raise your hand. I could find any number of pogroms, that is, attacks on Jews over the centuries. But I'm going to tell you about one that happened in 1096. Trier is where Constantine was. Were you Constantine? Who was Constantine?
No.
Okay. Constantine was born in Trier. It's the place that was very important to him. And he converts to Christianity, and his mother does what? She heads to Jerusalem, and she tries to find all of these important sites. She finds supposedly pieces of the cross, and she finds a robe that she thinks Jesus wore. She brings it back, puts it in Trier, and to this day, the robe is still there in Trier. And in the first crusade, a guy named Peter the Hermit was leading it, and the group was pretty massive. It's possible that it was as large as 1 million people moving together, warriors, people who had been fighting against each other, but the Pope said, if you go down to Jerusalem, retake it for the Christians, you get eternal life. And so all of these groups quit fighting each other, come together, and they start heading down to Jerusalem to retake the city. But they stop along the way in Germany. They stop on the Rhine River, and they stop in Trier. And things are getting restless, people are starting to fight with each other, so Peter decides we need an outside enemy. So the First Crusade gets to Jerusalem in 1099. 3 years earlier, he gives a sermon on Good Friday describing how the Jews killed Jesus. The group of followers get all agitated, worked up. They go and attack all of the Jews in Trier. And the Jews in Trier run to the cathedral where the robe is, and the bishop protects them for a week, 2 weeks or something like that. And they've got tens of thousands of Christians surrounding the cathedral, ordering the bishop to release the Jews. After 2 weeks, he decides to do it. And they start slaughtering and killing Jews. And it goes to the point where they're starting to kill people, and this young woman who's very attractive comes forward and says, I won't convert, you can cut my throat. And they decide not to do it, and she runs down the road, jumps off a bridge, and commits suicide. And they said, okay, this isn't really working too well, and this isn't great propaganda for us. We don't want people knowing we're doing this. But then they get restless again, and they spend the next year going up and down the Rhine, killing Jews in community after community. This is a history, the conclusion of a history that I read on this from earlier this year. The anti-Jewish violence that accompanied the First Crusade then was linked with the followers of Peter the Hermit or Peter the Prelate, either one. And the bands galvanized into action by his preaching. The range of anti-Jewish activity was broad, extending from limited spontaneous violence to full-scale military attacks on the Jewish communities throughout Cologne and Mainz. So this is what was going on in Jerusalem, and those of us who went to, the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, that's a creation of Constantine's mom doing this stuff, and it all comes full circle where we end up coming back to Germany, where the Crusaders end up doing horrible things on the way to trying to recapture what happens there. So I ran a little bit long. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about this? I'll let him go first. Okay.
How did all these Jews get to Germany?
How these Jews get to Germany?
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know.
I'll tell you a book to get. It's called Mankind and Mother Earth by Dr. Arnold Toynbee. He did his doctorate on migrations of peoples, and it's very enlightening.
They were mainly at the 1400s. They were mainly in Spain, and there's two groups: the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews. They're very different in terms of class, traditions, and all those things. And the most successful ones were in Spain, where Spain had Christians, Jews, and Muslims all living together, and things were going pretty well until 1492. Not that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but they started the Inquisition. And the Inquisition reached this point where they end up moving ahead and saying, if you convert, you're still a Jew, and they're executing Jews in mass, and the Jews from Spain then move across Europe to other locations. And it is, well, I told you there were a number of reasons for the Holocaust. One was economic, one was major economic. Germany was very slow at buying into the Industrial Revolution. America was far, far ahead of them. And then when they were hit with the Treaty of Versailles, the only people that seemed to be doing pretty well were some of the Jews. And so they turned all of the frustration about the economy, the money, the reparations that were supposed to be done. And there was already this tradition that Jews were horrible and money lenders and these sorts of things, so they turned on them at that point. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, the one thing that struck me, I had an aunt that collected the Apocrypha, all the scriptures, and even the Book of Mormon, and when I'd visit her, I'd read some stuff, and what struck me in the Book of Mormon, there are some anti-Semitic stuff in there too, and one passage that always stuck with me was only the Jews could kill their own God. That struck me as very severe.
So those 4 takeaways, that he did not like the Jews, and he wrote very strongly anti-Jewish things. 2, he didn't create anti-Semitism. A lot of people were doing this, and you can do what you want with this stuff. Is it just that he was a product of his time? But at the same time, he had personal and political power. 3, that his writings had an influence on people around the world. But 4, he didn't create the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened for a number of reasons, many, many reasons, not because of what Luther was writing, but it's something we should be aware of. As I said, it's sort of like knowing Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Yes, he did wonderful things, right? Declaration of Independence and other stuff, but at the same time, he also made his mistakes. They're humans, and they make mistakes. So, thank you very much.
Couple of quick things before we go. Thanks, Dan. I think we're shooting for a 10 o'clock leave time, just so people know on that day. I know there's some discrepancy about that. I think people wanted to get down there a little sooner, so we're kind of shooting for 10 to be packing the bus to go. Next month, we'll do more of just the details of the trip and what do you have to know to go kind of thing. But in Linda's email, she asked you to bring the tip money. So the idea with that covers the bus there and back from O'Hare and back for us that do that. And then also all of the tips for all of our different helpers along the way. We're going to have a lot of helpers helping us out, so that's a big thing. And as we talked about it, one of the things we thought would really help, instead of getting off the plane and having to go sit at a bank trying to change money, and I guess it took Gail like an hour and a half last time, we're going to try and round up that money ahead of time. We can get some of that done. So in that 150 that we asked you for, 15 of that goes to that, so we'll give that back to you so you can just have the money for lunch and you won't have to chase around trying to find it right after we get off the plane. So any quick questions before we let you go?
Euros are low right now.
Yeah, this is a different currency we're looking at. But so if you have checks, you can give them to Linda. She's checking you off back there in the back. But thanks so much again for Dan and for Matt, and appreciate it. Let us know if you have other questions. Thanks.
With your question, what happened during the time of Assyria and Babylon? You read the scriptures, you see that the Assyrians didn't enslave the northern 10 tribes of Israel. They just relocated them. And it says in the Bible, the river Gozan, the area of the river Gozan. You look at the map, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, you'll see the river Quazalozan. That's the same river is still there today. And what happens is Babylonians rise in power. The Syrians, they don't like this, even though they're cousins. They're Arabs. This is before Islam or any of that. They're Arabs. And they don't like the idea that the Babylonians are getting uppity. So they start fighting against one another. And while this conflict is going on, all of these people, the northern 10 tribes of Israel, they get out. That's where the word Caucasian comes from. They went through between the Caucasus Mountains, between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, into Eastern Europe. They are practicing their religion, of the living God. A group comes from Central Asia, and their king, if they have no religion, he thinks this is a good thing. These guys are organized. This is really good. So he says, teach us your religion. So they do. And they all start practicing. Now, they're considered Ashkenazim, or Ashkenaz Jews from Central Asia, and a mixture with the Israelites. And what happens is they start to populate Eastern and Central Europe. Years go by, and they start Christianizing people, and lo and behold, I don't know who's who right now, and neither do they. Because if you read the book Ezekiel, God gets angry with the children of Israel. And their most important thing is who they are, which tribe they're from, and their census. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. We have more people than you do in the tribe of Issachar, and more people than you have in the tribe of Dan. They're become very arrogant about who they are, which tribe they come from. Ezekiel tells them, because you're stiff-necked people, God is going to take away your identity and give it to someone else. So even though they call them Jews in the Old Testament times, Jews of today are the ones who came through Spain, which are the Sephardim. They speak Hebrew. The ones from Eastern Europe, they speak Yiddish, which is very close to a Germanic language, Hungarian language, and it all becomes a mixture during those times. But that's where the northern 10 tribes of Israel are, all over, and they're now in Western Europe. They're all over the place. They have no clue.
There's so many more Jews in Europe than there was.
And they have no clue who they are, which tribe they came from, because they were confused, because they were stiff-necked people. But Isaiah says, you will bring the true religion to the world. So we got to assume that Christian peoples somehow are related. But we can't prove it. There's no way. I had a woman once who secretary told me I could trace my ancestry back to Charlemagne. And I said to her, I said, Mary, you can't trace your history back 300 years. I said, all of these records and stuff are disappeared during wars.
I don't either.
They've been moved here, they've been
I
moved
figure if I
there.
can walk, that's the best thing.
It's interesting. It's interesting how the Muslims have been kept out of Western Europe by Richard Martel, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne. He took a bunch of farmers and trained them as soldiers, and they went, and when the Muslims came, they saw these humongous groups of people who turned around and went back. And on the eastern side, this guy was one of the real savages, was Vlad the Impaler. He took 1,000 Muslims and impaled them on the border. The other ones saw that and they said, we want no part of this guy. They turned around and went back. He was the one that they fashioned Dracula after.
Yeah, I think I've heard that.
I don't know.
Actually, it's
I have to look at the other day.
Nosferatu Draculi, the red dragon is what it means, and they shortened it to Dracula.
But I still like most.
You are.
Mostly because
It was just stop.
the justices are really not. I mean, it's a system where they're
small microcosm of the world the way it is now. Everybody.
and you can't fire them, but they are